For centuries, history books have whispered half-truths about the past, leaving us with the impression that ancient power was exclusively male. But behind the grand statues of kings and conquerors, another story has been waiting to be told. One of queens who commanded armies, empresses who shaped civilizations, and warrior women who shattered expectations. What if everything we thought we knew about ancient leadership only showed us half the picture? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 30 of history's most extraordinary female rulers, women whose names should be as familiar as Alexander or Caesar, yet whose stories have been overshadowed, minimized, or erased entirely. Imagine a world where a woman could rise from prisoner to pharaoh, where a teenage queen could outmaneuver empires, or where a widow's grief transformed into a reign that changed the course of history. These aren't exceptions, they're part of a hidden tapestry of power woven by women across continents and centuries. From the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of the Caucasus, from the bustling markets of ancient China to the marble halls of Rome, these rulers didn't just occupy thrones, they redefined them. They led armies, brokered peace, built monuments, and in some cases ruled with such brilliance that their reigns became the golden ages of their civilizations. What makes their stories even more remarkable isn't just what they achieved, it's how they did it. In societies that often saw them as outsiders, these women mastered the art of power in ways their male counterparts never had to. They navigated webs of intrigue, turned societal expectations to their advantage, and in some cases rewrote the rules entirely. Some wielded swords, others wielded diplomacy, but all of them left an indelible mark on history. And yet, for every Cleopatra we remember, there are a dozen others whose names have been buried by time, until now. Over the course of this journey, we'll uncover their triumphs, their strategies, and the astonishing legacies they left behind. So if you've ever wondered what history looks like when we finally listen to all its voices, not just the loudest ones, you're about to find out. Our journey begins with a woman who didn't just wear the crown, she reinvented it. Hatshepsut, the daughter of a pharaoh, stepped into history not as a queen consort or regent, but as Egypt's undisputed ruler at a time when women weren't meant to hold power alone. But here's the twist, she didn't seize the throne in a bloody coup or through marriage. Instead, she staged what might be history's first carefully crafted rebranding campaign. After acting as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, she quietly shifted the narrative, portraying herself not merely as a placeholder, but as a divinely chosen leader. And then she did something unprecedented. On temple walls and towering obelisks, she appeared not in the flowing gowns of a queen, but in the traditional kilt, false beard, and muscular physique of a male pharaoh. This wasn't just cross-dressing, it was political theater on a monumental scale, a way to satisfy tradition while bending it to her will. Her reign became one of Egypt's most prosperous eras, not through conquest, but through shrewd diplomacy and architectural ambition. While later pharaohs obsessed with military glory, Hatshepsut sent trade expeditions to the distant land of Punt, bringing back gold, ivory, and fragrant myrrh. Her greatest masterpiece, the terraced temple of Der el-Bahari, rose like a staircase to the gods, its colonnades telling the story of her divine birth and legitimizing her rule. Every pillar was a political statement, every mural a carefully crafted argument for why a woman could and should hold power. But history has a way of silencing those who break the mold. After her death, someone chiseled Hatshepsut's name from monuments, toppled her statues, and buried her legacy quite literally in a pile of rubble. For centuries, Egyptologists assumed this erasure was the work of a jealous stepson. But recent discoveries suggest a more complicated truth. This wasn't personal vengeance, but a calculated rewriting of history to restore what some saw as the natural order. The irony, by trying to erase her, they only made her story more tantalizing. When archaeologists uncovered her vandalized statues in the 19th century, they found something astonishing beneath the defaced surface. The stone still held traces of her true face, serene and unbroken, waiting to be remembered. If Hatshepsut rewrote the rules of power, Sobekneferu was the woman who proved they could be broken entirely. Stepping onto the stage of history nearly 300 years earlier, she didn't just rule Egypt, she became the first woman we know for certain held the full title of pharaoh, no disguises or apologies needed. Her reign was brief, just under 4 years, but its impact rippled far beyond its length. This was a time of crisis. The powerful 12th dynasty was collapsing. The Nile's floods had grown unreliable, and Egypt teetered on the edge of chaos. Enter Sobekneferu, a ruler who didn't inherit her throne through the usual lines of succession, but emerged as the only figure capable of holding a fractured kingdom together. What's astonishing isn't just that she ruled, but how she ruled. Unlike Hatshepsut's later theatrical reinvention, Sobekneferu seems to have embraced her femininity while wielding absolute authority. Statues show her wearing the traditional regalia of kingship, the Nemes headcloth, the crook and flail, but paired with distinctly feminine attire beneath. She didn't erase her identity to fit the mold, she expanded the mold to fit her. Her very name honored Sobek, the fierce crocodile god of military might and fertility, a brilliant fusion of strength and life-giving power that mirrored her own role. The monuments she left behind tell a story of a ruler scrambling to stabilize a reeling nation. Where her predecessors built towering pyramids, her surviving works are humbler additions to existing temples, repairs to neglected shrines. These weren't vanity projects but strategic moves, reinforcing religious institutions to shore up her legitimacy and unite a people shaken by environmental and political turmoil. Even her choice to complete her father's funerary complex rather than build her own speaks volumes. This was a pharaoh more concerned with continuity than personal glory. Then, as suddenly as she appeared, Sobekneferu vanished from the record. No known tomb, no clear successor, just silence. For centuries, historians treated her as a footnote, a curious anomaly before the dynasty's collapse. But modern archaeology suggests something far more significant, that her reign wasn't an accident of history but a deliberate solution to a kingdom in freefall. In those critical years, she may have been the glue holding Egypt together, preventing total disintegration before the next dynasty could rise. The irony. The very crisis that made her rule necessary also ensured her legacy would be fragmented until now. While Hatshepsut and Sobekneferu redefined kingship, Nefertiti shattered expectations in an entirely different way, not by adapting to the rules of power, but by helping rewrite them entirely. Picture this: Egypt in the 14th century before the Common Era, a land where gods had thousands of temples, where pharaohs ruled through divine tradition. Then came Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king, who upended centuries of belief by declaring the sun disk Aten the one true god. But standing beside him wasn't just any queen, it was Nefertiti, a woman whose influence was so profound that historians still debate whether she was merely a consort or something far more revolutionary. The Amana period, as this era became known, wasn't just a religious revolution, it was a cultural earthquake. And Nefertiti wasn't merely witnessing it, she was helping lead it. Unlike earlier queens who appeared passively in art, Nefertiti's likeness surged to the forefront. In temple carvings, she's shown striking down enemies, performing rituals once reserved for pharaohs, even standing equal in size to Akhenaten, an artistic choice screaming political significance. One famous relief shows her driving a chariot through the streets of their new capital, Akhenaten, sunlight streaming over her as if she herself were divine. This wasn't traditional queenly behavior, it was the visual language of a co-ruler. What makes her role even more fascinating are the tantalizing clues suggesting she may have outlived her husband to rule alone under the name Neferneferuaten. A handful of inscriptions mention this mysterious pharaoh who briefly held power after Akhenaten's death, someone who continued his reforms but with subtle differences. Some Egyptologists point to a striking fact. The name Neferneferuiten translates to "beautiful are the beauties of Aten," echoing Nefertiti's own titles. Then there's the unfinished tomb in Amarna, where chisel marks suggest someone erased this ruler's image in haste, just as Nefertiti's own likeness was later defaced when traditionalists restored the old gods. The evidence is fragmented, like pieces of a papyrus scattered by time. But consider this: in the chaos following Akhenaten's death, with foreign threats looming and Egypt's old priesthoods eager for revenge, who better to steer the sinking ship than the woman who'd helped build it? Nefertiti knew the players, the policies, the precarious balance of their new theology. If she did take the throne, even briefly, it would explain why her mummy has never been identified. Her enemies had every reason to dismantle her legacy. Yet perhaps her greatest power wasn't political but ideological. Long after Amarna's palaces crumbled, Nefertiti's face endured. The iconic bust in Berlin, with its precise symmetry and unearthly serenity, captures something timeless. Here was a woman who didn't just share power, she helped conceptualize it, shaping a vision of rule where spirituality and sovereignty intertwined. In a civilization that measured time in dynasties, she proved ideas could outlast stone. Cleopatra VII wasn't just the last pharaoh of Egypt, she was a master strategist who played the political game with a brilliance Hollywood rarely captures. Forget the golden barge and the asp. The real story is how a teenage queen, exiled by her own brother, clawed her way back to power through sheer cunning. Fluent in at least 9 languages, she was the first Ptolemy in 3 centuries to actually speak Egyptian, a deliberate move to connect with her subjects. But her true genius lay in understanding that Egypt's survival depended on Rome's favor. Where others saw an empire to fear, Cleopatra saw chess pieces waiting to be moved. Her alliance with Julius Caesar wasn't some romantic fling, it was a calculated power play. When her brother's forces surrounded her palace, she didn't send a messenger to beg for help. Instead, legend says she had herself rolled into a carpet and smuggled directly to Caesar's quarters, emerging not as a supplicant but as a fellow ruler offering a partnership. The move secured her throne, but it was her intellect that kept it. Nights spent debating philosophy and science with Rome's greatest minds weren't just courtly entertainment, they were demonstrations of her legitimacy. Even Caesar, a man who conquered nations, reportedly left their meetings in awe. Then came Mark Antony, and here's where history twists the knife. Their relationship wasn't the decadent distraction Roman propaganda painted it to be. The infamous banquet of the inimitable livers, that was statecraft disguised as revelry. By showcasing Egypt's wealth and cultural sophistication, Cleopatra positioned herself as Antony's equal, not his mistress. When she appeared as the goddess Isis at Tarsus, it wasn't mere theater. It was a visual manifesto of her divine right to rule. Together, they envisioned a Greco-Roman-Egyptian empire that might have reshaped the ancient world had Octavian not weaponized Roman xenophobia against them. The end, when it came, was as meticulously staged as her rise. Cornered in Alexandria, she didn't flee or grovel. Choosing poison over paraded humiliation, she turned her death into one last act of sovereignty. The asp, if it even happened, was symbolic, a sacred creature of the goddess Wadjet, ensuring her passage into eternity as Egypt's rightful ruler. Octavian could take her kingdom, but not her legacy. 2,000 years later, we still debate her, proving the ultimate irony. The woman Rome tried to erase became immortal. While Egypt's queens battled for legitimacy, another warrior queen was reshaping the destiny of an entire kingdom. Not through diplomacy or divine theater, but on the battlefield itself. Amanirenas, the one-eyed queen of Kush, didn't just defy Rome. She marched her armies north and struck first, becoming one of the few leaders to humiliate the empire at the height of its power. Picture this, the year 25 before the Common Era, when Augustus Caesar ruled a Rome that seemed unstoppable. Across the Mediterranean, kingdoms either bowed or burned. Yet here was Amanirenas, a ruler from what is now Sudan, launching a preemptive attack so audacious it left historians speechless. Her campaign began with a lightning strike on the Roman garrison at Aswan, a strategic jewel on the Nile. While Rome was distracted by revolts in Arabia, her forces sacked the city, tore down statues of Augustus, and even hauled a bronze head of the emperor back to Kush as a trophy. This wasn't just a raid, it was a declaration. The message: Kush would not wait to be swallowed by Rome's expansion. They would define the terms of engagement. What followed was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. When Rome retaliated, sending legions deep into Kushite territory, Amanirenas refused to meet them in conventional battle. Instead, she employed scorched earth tactics, poisoning wells and burning crops to starve the advancing forces. The desert became her ally, stretching Roman supply lines to the breaking point. In one legendary clash, she lost an eye, but the injury only fueled her reputation. By the time negotiations began, the Romans faced a queen who'd proven she could bleed but not break. The peace treaty that emerged stands as a testament to her brilliance. Kush kept its independence, its borders untouched, and even secured exemption from tribute payments to Rome. In an era when most kingdoms became Roman provinces, Amanirenas won something extraordinary: respect. The details of the agreement, preserved on an ancient papyrus, reveal Rome compromising with an adversary for perhaps the first time in its imperial history. Her legacy echoes in the ruins of her capital, Meroe, where temples still bear inscriptions celebrating her victories. Unlike so many rulers who faded into myth, Amanirenas left something tangible: a head of Augustus buried beneath the steps of a Kushite shrine, so every visitor would literally walk over the face of Rome's emperor. A final, silent boast from a queen who refused to know her place. Shanakht didn't just inherit a throne, she shattered a mold. 200 years after Amanirenas terrified Rome, this warrior queen of Kush did something no woman before her had dared. She commissioned a pyramid with her name in hieroglyphics, not as a consort or regent, but as the undisputed sovereign. The ruins of Meroe still whisper her defiance. A sandstone relief shows her seated on a lion throne, towering over a line of bound prisoners, while a slender male figure stands behind her, his role reduced to a footnote. This wasn't just art, it was propaganda carved in stone, a declaration that in Kush, power could wear a skirt. What makes her reign so groundbreaking isn't just that she ruled, but how she reimagined kingship itself. Earlier Kushite queens had wielded influence, but Shanakht inscriptions tell a different story. In the temple of Apodamak, the lion god of war, she's depicted receiving divine legitimacy directly from the deity, a privilege previously reserved for male rulers. Even her titulary broke conventions. Where male pharaohs of Kush used the title Kor, meaning ruler, she adopted the feminine Koran, tailoring tradition to fit her reality without apology. The archaeological record reveals a ruler deeply engaged in the machinery of state. Broken seals bearing her name suggest she personally oversaw trade networks stretching to the Red Sea, while fragments of pottery inscribed with tax records hint at a sophisticated bureaucracy answering to her alone. But her most audacious move was architectural. While earlier Kushite pyramids were modest, Shanakht's tomb at Meroe soared, a deliberate echo of Egypt's grandest monuments, as if to say her legacy would loom just as large. The interior walls, though eroded by time, once blazed with color. Scenes of the queen making offerings to Osiris, her Ka spirit welcomed into the afterlife as an equal among gods. Historians once assumed her male consort handled military matters, but recent discoveries upend that assumption. Near the ruins of Nokka, a sandstone slab shows Shanakht riding a war chariot, her bow drawn, an image echoing Amanirenas' battlefield prowess. The damage to the carving tells its own story. Someone later chiseled away her face, a clumsy attempt to rewrite history that only proves how threatening her example remained. Her end, like much of Kushite history, is shrouded in silence, but the pyramid she left behind stands as a stone manifesto. In a civilization caught between Egyptian tradition and African innovation, Shanakdakhit carved a third path, one where gender bent to the will of capability. Centuries later, when the Roman historian Dio Cassius wrote of Kush's warrior queens, he wasn't inventing legends. He was recording an inheritance Shanakdakhit helped forge. Arsinoe II didn't just marry for power, she weaponized marriage as diplomatic artillery, transforming personal unions into geopolitical masterstrokes. Born into the cutthroat world of Ptolemaic Egypt, where sibling marriages weren't just tradition but survival strategy, she elevated the practice to an art form. Her first marriage to Lysimachus of Thrace wasn't merely a political alliance, it was a calculated move to expand Ptolemaic influence into Europe. As queen consort, she didn't fade into the background. She governed cities, minted coins bearing her likeness, and even intervened in succession disputes. But when Lysimachus fell in battle, Arsinoe didn't retreat to the shadows. She pivoted, marrying her half-brother Ptolemy Koronos in a bid to secure Macedonia. The twist: he murdered 2 of her sons days after the wedding. What happened next redefined resilience. Fleeing to Egypt, she turned disaster into dynasty. Marrying her full brother Ptolemy II wasn't just scandalous, it was revolutionary. While brother-sister marriages existed among pharaohs, Arsinoe engineered something unprecedented: co-rule. Temples depicted them as twin deities, equal in stature, sharing the same titles. She didn't just stand beside the throne, she reshaped it, introducing the concept of the Philadelphoi, sibling-loving monarchy. This wasn't incestuous pageantry, it was brand management, positioning the Ptolemies as both Macedonian rulers and heirs to Egypt's divine kingship. Her genius lay in symbolism. When she deified herself as Thea Philadelphus, she didn't wait for death like past rulers. Living goddesshood became her political superpower. Temples from Alexandria to Cyprus showcased her as Isis incarnate, her image fused with Aphrodite's. A deliberate fusion of Greek and Egyptian iconography that became Cleopatra's playbook. Even military victories were credited to her divine favor. A naval win against Macedonia was framed as Arsinoe's vengeance from beyond the grave. The financial archives of her reign reveal a ruler thinking centuries ahead. She established the Arsinoean, a tax-free zone for Mediterranean trade that funneled wealth directly into royal coffers. Her face adorned not just coins but weights and measures, standardizing commerce while stamping her authority onto everyday life. And when she died, her cult didn't fade, it flourished. Villages named Arsinoe sprouted from the Nile Delta to the Aegean, and her festivals outlasted dynasties. The true measure of her influence: Cleopatra's entire modus operandi, divine pretensions, sibling marriages, even the maritime economic policies were Arsinoe's innovations repackaged. Where earlier queens had been power behind thrones, she became power personified, proving a woman could be both goddess and general, sister, wife, and sovereign. The Ptolemies spent 2 centuries trying to replicate her alchemy. None ever quite matched the original. Zenobia of Palmyra didn't just rebel against Rome, she rewrote the playbook on how to dismantle an empire. In the chaotic 3rd century, when Rome's grip on its provinces was fraying, this Syrian queen saw an opportunity not just for independence but for dominion. With the emperor distracted by Gothic invasions and internal strife, she launched a campaign so audacious it still echoes in the deserts of the Middle East. But here's what most histories overlook: this wasn't some reckless uprising. Zenobia was a scholar queen who spoke 4 languages, patronized philosophers, and traced her lineage to Cleopatra, a pedigree she wielded like a sword when she marched into Egypt. Her conquest of Alexandria in 270 was no barbarian raid. It was a calculated revival of Ptolemaic glory. Roman historians painted her as a power-hungry usurper, but papyri from the era tell a different story. tax reforms eased burdens on Egyptian farmers, and her coins bore the double cornucopia, a deliberate nod to Cleopatra's prosperous reign. For a fleeting moment, Zenobia's Pomeran Empire stretched from Antioch to the Nile, a shimmering mirage of what the East could be without Rome's heavy hand. What set her apart wasn't just military brilliance but cultural vision. In Palmyra's sun-baked courtyards, she blended Roman law with Persian court rituals while elevating local deities like Bel to equal standing with Jupiter. Her court became a haven for Neoplatonist thinkers, and her chief advisor, Cassius Longinus, was the era's most celebrated rhetorician. This wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was an experiment in pluralistic rule where Greek, Roman, and Semitic traditions could coexist. Then came Emperor Aurelian, the restorer of the world, and the confrontation that would seal her legend. Even in defeat, Zenobia outmaneuvered expectations. Captured and paraded through Rome in golden chains, a spectacle meant to humiliate, she turned the tables. Some accounts claim she charmed Aurelian so thoroughly that he granted her a villa in Tibur, where she lived out her days as a philosopher matron. Others whisper she starved herself rather than endure subjugation. The truth, both versions serve her mythos better than any victory could. Today, Syrian schoolbooks hail her as a national icon, while Roman historians reduced her to a footnote. But walk through Palmyra's colonnades, what war hasn't destroyed, and you'll find her everywhere in the bilingual inscriptions asserting Pomeran identity, in the temple reliefs where she offers incense as both queen and high priestess. Zenobia proved empires aren't invincible, just vulnerable to the right woman with the right vision at the right moment. Boudicca's rage ignited like wildfire across Roman Britain, not just a rebellion, but an inferno of vengeance that would leave scorch marks on history itself. Imagine the scene, the year 60 or 61 of the Common Era, a time when Rome's legions believed their hold on Britannia was unshakable. Then came the Celtic queen, towering in her chariot, her red hair like a banner of war, leading a coalition of tribes who'd endured one indignity too many. The spark, a horror story of Roman greed and brutality. After her husband, King Prasutagus, died, leaving half his kingdom to Rome and half to their daughters, the Romans responded by flogging Boudicca, raping her daughters, and seizing everything. But this wasn't just personal, it was systemic. Roman tax collectors had been strangling the Iceni with debt, while local officials enslaved tribesmen for refusing to surrender ancestral land. Boudicca didn't just want revenge, she aimed to erase Rome from Britain entirely. Her campaign began with a storm of fury. Camulogenum, Rome's earliest stronghold in Britain, fell first. Veterans who'd stolen Celtic farms were slaughtered in their baths. The Temple of Claudius, a symbol of imperial oppression, razed to the ground. Then came Londinium. The thriving trade hub had no walls, no legions stationed nearby, just merchants and families who watched in terror as Boudicca's forces swept in. Archaeological layers still bear witness, a thick band of burned debris dubbed Boudicca's destruction horizon, littered with melted pottery and charred bones. The Roman historian Tacitus, our primary source, paints a chilling picture of 80,000 dead. Whether exaggerated or not, the message was clear. This wasn't war, it was annihilation, yet beneath the violence lay startling strategy. Boudicca didn't just attack randomly, she targeted Roman symbols of power. Tax records burned in Verulamium, freeing tribes from debt slavery, supply lines severed to starve isolated garrisons. Even her choice of timing was strategic, striking while the governor Suetonius Paulinus was busy crushing Druid resistance on the island of Mona. For months, Rome's mighty machine faltered against a queen who understood its weaknesses. The final battle remains one of history's great what-ifs. Somewhere along Watling Street, Suetonius finally cornered her forces. Though outnumbered, his disciplined legions formed a killing box, their armor turning Celtic swords while their javelins rained death. The exact location is lost, but the outcome wasn't. Boudicca's army, packed with families and supply wagons, became a slaughter pen. yet her end is shrouded in poetic ambiguity. Tacitus claims she took poison to avoid capture, while Cassius Dio insists she fell ill and died. Either way, her defiance became legend. The irony: Rome tried to bury her legacy, but Boudicca's revolt forced change. Taxes were eased, corrupt officials recalled, proof that even in defeat, she'd shaken the empire to its core. Today, a bronze statue of her stands near Westminster Pier, chariot knives gleaming toward the Thames. Not a monument to victory, but to the unbreakable spirit of resistance, and perhaps that's why her story endures, not because she won, but because she dared. Artemisia of Caria sailed into history as the only woman commander in Xerxes' vast invasion fleet, a Greek queen fighting for Persia, a strategist whose brilliance earned admiration even from her enemies. Picture the Aegean in 480 before the Common Era, where thousands of Persian ships darkened the horizon. Among them, Artemisia's flagship stood out not just for its crimson sails, but for the woman standing fearless on its deck. Unlike the consorts and priestesses history usually relegated to the sidelines, here was a ruler who led from the front, commanding 5 of Halicarnassus' finest warships. But what made her truly extraordinary wasn't just her presence, it was the way she outthought everyone around her. The Battle of Salamis should have been her downfall. Trapped in the narrow straits as the Greek fleet closed in, Artemisia found herself cornered by an Athenian trireme. In a move that still stuns historians, she ordered her crew to ram her own allies, a Persian ship, sending it to the bottom. The gambit worked. The Greeks, assuming her vessel was defecting, broke off pursuit, while Xerxes, watching from shore, assumed she'd heroically sunk an enemy. Herodotus recounts the Persian king's delighted cry, "My men have become women, and my women men." The moment captures Artemisia's essence, a leader who understood that survival sometimes meant making the ruthless choice. Her political instincts proved just as sharp. When Xerxes gathered his commanders after the disaster at Salamis, most urged another attack. Artemisia alone dared to dissent. In a masterstroke of reverse psychology, she advised retreat, framing it as strategic patience. Let the Greeks fracture without Persian gold holding their alliance together. Herodotus, though Greek himself, couldn't hide his awe, noting how she alone had the courage to speak the truth. Xerxes, perhaps recognizing wisdom when he heard it, sent her to escort his sons safely home while the rest of his army met catastrophe. The puzzle of Artemisia isn't just how she thrived in a man's world, it's why history remembered her so fondly despite fighting for the enemy. Unlike later portrayals of Eastern queens as decadent or cruel, Herodotus paints her as the most rational voice in Xerxes' war council, a ruler who valued pragmatism over pride. Even her origins defy simple labels. A Greek-speaking monarch from Caria, culturally Persian yet never fully either, she navigated identities as deftly as she navigated the Aegean's treacherous currents. Her legacy lingers in the ruins of Halicarnassus, where later queens like Ada would invoke her name as proof that women could rule as effectively as men. But perhaps the greatest testament to Artemisia lies in what she refused to be, a cautionary tale or a footnote. In an era when women's stories were often reduced to morality plays, she emerges as something rare, a genuinely complex leader, admired not despite her gender but for the sheer force of her intellect. The Persians lost at Salamis, but Artemisia, she sailed away undefeated. Tomyris of the Massagetae didn't just defeat Cyrus the Great, she turned the Persian Empire's greatest conqueror into a cautionary tale. Picture the vast Central Asian steppes in the 6th century before the Common Era, where Cyrus, fresh from toppling Babylon and Lydia, set his sights on the nomadic Massagetae. Their queen, Tomyris, ruled a people so fierce even the Persians hesitated, but Cyrus, confident in his unstoppable momentum, sent a marriage proposal thinly disguising his demand for submission. Her reply became legendary: rule your own people and try not to covet what belongs to others. When diplomacy failed, Cyrus learned the hard way that some lines shouldn't be crossed. The battle that followed was a masterclass in turning an enemy's strength against him. Knowing the Massageta's cavalry outmatched his infantry, Cyrus set a trap, abandoning his camp with casks of wine, a luxury unknown to the nomad. When Tomarus's son Spargapises led a raid, his warriors drank themselves into oblivion. The Persians slaughtered them, capturing Spargapises alive, but Cyrus underestimated a mother's rage. Spargapises, upon sobering, took his own life rather than endure captivity. The grief-stricken Tomarus didn't just vow revenge, she dictated its terms. In her next message to Cyrus, she promised to give him his fill of blood. Their final confrontation shattered Persian invincibility. Tomarus lured Cyrus's forces deep into the steppe, where her horse archers harried them with hit-and-run attacks. When the exhausted Persians reached the Araxes River, they found no escape, only Massagetae warriors waiting like a steel tide. The battle was a massacre. Cyrus himself fell, his head severed by Tomarus's order. Then came the moment that etched her into history. She plunged that head into a wineskin filled with blood, declaring, "You thirsted for blood, now drink your fill." A grisly symbol, yes, but also a stark lesson about the cost of unchecked ambition. What's fascinating isn't just her victory, but how cultures adopted her story. Greek historians like Herodotus framed her as the noble savage, a moral counterpoint to Persian decadence. Renaissance artists painted her holding Cyrus's head as a warning against hubris. Even Machiavelli praised her strategic genius. Yet the Massagetae left no written records. Her legend survives solely through the voices of those she defeated. Modern archaeologists still search for traces of her people near the Aral Sea, but the land keeps its secrets. Tomarus's legacy thrives precisely because it's irreducible. She wasn't just a warrior queen, she was the embodiment of a boundary. In her story, empires learned that some horizons aren't meant to be conquered, and some women refuse to be bargaining chips. 2.5 millennia later, Kazakhstan minted her image on coins, celebrating the steppe's unbreakable spirit. The queen who vanished into the grasslands still stands as history's eternal rebuttal to the myth of inevitable conquest. Semiramis, the name alone, conjures images of towering ziggurats and armies stretching to the horizon. A queen so formidable she blurred the line between history and myth. Assyrian inscriptions mention a powerful regent named Shamuramat, but it's the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus who spins her into something grander. A warrior architect who marched across continents, built Babylon's Hanging Gardens centuries before Nebuchadnezzar, and even invaded India on elephant back. The problem: these accounts were written 500 years after her reign, weaving fact with folklore until the threads became inseparable. Start with the historical core. Shamuramat ruled as regent for her young son Adad-nirari III in the 9th century before the Common Era, a rare feat in Assyria's patriarchal monarchy. A stele from Ashur confirms her authority, showing her name alongside the king's in prayers to the god Nabu. Unlike later legends, this was no flamboyant conqueror but a shrewd stabilizer. Her reign marked the end of a turbulent civil war, and she likely negotiated crucial alliances with Babylon. Yet within a few generations, her story began to mutate. Babylonian scribes, perhaps resentful of Assyrian dominance, recast her as a seductress who murdered her husband to seize power. By the time Greek travelers heard the tales, Semiramis had become a hybrid of Eastern mystique and Hellenic heroism, a canvas for every imperial fantasy. The architectural myths revealed just as much about their creators as about Semiramis herself. The so-called Hanging Gardens attributed to her were likely a Greek mix-up. Babylon's terraced gardens were built later, but the idea of a woman orchestrating such marvels fit the Orientalist trope of exotic luxury. Even her military campaigns, like the invasion of India, echo older Mesopotamian motifs of queens confronting beasts and distant lands. Diodorus describes her army bridging rivers with pontoons and scaling cliffs with iron spikes, details suspiciously similar to Persian engineering feats. Here's where it gets fascinating. The legends aren't just fabrications, they reflect real anxieties about female power. Assyrian art often portrayed queens as intercessors with the gods, yet Greek accounts fixated on Semiramis's alleged sexual voracity, a pattern seen with Cleopatra and Zenobia. The same woman history remembers as a stabilizer became, in myth, either a monstrous usurper or a romanticized superwoman. Perhaps the truth lies in the gaps. The real Shamuramat likely expanded trade routes, patronized temples, and held the throne long enough to ensure her son's succession, the mythical Semiramis. She belongs to the realm of collective imagination, a mirror for every era's fascinations and fears. Walk through the ruins of Nineveh today and you won't find her hanging gardens. But you might sense her shadow not just in stone, but in the stubborn persistence of stories that refuse to let a remarkable woman fade quietly into the past. Pujuhepa didn't just share the Hittite throne, she rewrote the rules of ancient diplomacy while wearing the robes of a high priestess. Picture the Bronze Age world around 1250 before the Common Era, where empires rose and fell on alliances sealed by clay tablets. At the heart of this diplomatic web stood Pujuhepa, queen of the Hittites, corresponding with pharaohs and kings in a voice so authoritative that Ramses II addressed her as "my sister," a title reserved for equals. But her power wasn't just political, it was divine. As the high priestess of the sun goddess Araniti, Pujuhepa didn't merely advise her husband, King Hattusili III. She ruled alongside him, her name etched into treaties and temple walls with the same weight as his. Their partnership reshaped an empire. When Hattusili seized the throne from his nephew, it was Pujuhepa who legitimized the coup through religious decree, claiming the storm god himself had chosen them. Together, they faced a Hittite kingdom weakened by famine and rival claims. Her solution, a diplomatic masterstroke, the famous peace treaty with Egypt, ending decades of war after the Battle of Kadesh. The correspondence between Pujuhepa and Ramses reveals a woman who negotiated like a seasoned statesman. One clay letter, preserved in the scorched ruins of Hattusa, shows her tactfully reminding Ramses to send her medicinal herbs, blending statecraft with personal rapport. Another chides him for delaying the marriage of their children, a union critical to the treaty. "Why do you still hold back my daughter?" she writes, balancing maternal concern with imperial urgency. Yet her true genius lay in merging faith with foreign policy. While Hattusili handled military campaigns, Pujuhepa oversaw a religious revolution, merging Hittite and Hurrian pantheons to unite their multicultural empire. She didn't just pray to the gods, she interpreted their will. When a plague ravaged the land, she ordered rituals to appease neglected deities, blending Hurrian spells with Hittite hymns. Her reforms elevated female deities like Hebat to equal standing with male gods, a theological shift that mirrored her own role. Even Egypt took notice. Ramses requested her blessings for his own health, acknowledging her spiritual authority across borders. The artifacts she left behind tell a story of a queen who refused to be sidelined. A silver plaque shows her pouring libations beside Hattusili, her figure the same height as his. In the rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya, her image appears among the gods, an eternal testament to her dual role as queen and priestess. But perhaps her most enduring legacy is the ordinary. The dozens of legal judgments she issued, resolving land disputes and protecting widows' rights. These weren't the edicts of a figurehead, but of a hands-on ruler who understood that stability began with justice. When Hattusili died, Pujuhepa didn't retreat to the shadows. She guided their son Tudhaliya's reign, ensuring continuity until her own death. The empire she helped rebuild would crumble within decades, but her voice endures in the kiln-fired clay of her letters, proof that even in the ancient world, the pen or stylus could be as mighty as the sword. While Ramses built monuments to his own glory, Pujuhepa's monuments were the treaties that kept peace and the temples where her reforms outlasted kingdoms. A woman who ruled as both diplomat and divine intermediary, she reminds us that power in the ancient world wasn't always about who held the scepter, but who knew how to speak the language of gods and kings alike. Semiramit's name might not echo as loudly as Semiramis's through history, but her impact on the Assyrian Empire was anything but silent. Stepping into power as regent for her young son, Adad-nirari III in the 9th century before the Common Era, she didn't just keep the throne warm, she fortified it during one of Assyria's most volatile periods. Unlike the flamboyant conquerors often celebrated in Assyrian annals, Semiramit's legacy was woven through diplomacy and stability. Her reign marked the calm after a storm of civil strife, a rare moment when the empire caught its breath. What sets her apart isn't just that she ruled, it's how visibly she ruled. At a time when Assyrian queens typically operated behind palace walls, Semiramit left her signature in stone. A stele from Ashur, one of the empire's religious capitals, places her name alongside her son's in prayers to the god Nabu, a privilege almost unheard of for royal women. Even more striking, another monument at Nimrud, a city steeped in imperial grandeur, bears a joint dedication from mother and son. These weren't subtle nods to her influence, they were bold declarations of shared sovereignty. The myths that later swirled around Semiramis may have exaggerated her into a fantastical conqueror, but they didn't invent her political acumen. Historical records hint at Semiramit's deft handling of Babylon, Assyria's eternally restless vassal. While male rulers often resorted to brute force to keep Babylon in line, she seems to have favored a lighter touch, possibly negotiating trade agreements or religious concessions. A fragmentary inscription suggests she traveled to Babylon personally, an extraordinary move for an Assyrian monarch, let alone a queen regent. Whether she was paying homage to the city's gods or brokering deals, the gesture spoke volumes about her willingness to engage with rivals on their own terms. Her connection to the Semiramis legends reveals just as much about ancient anxieties as it does about her real achievements. Later Greek historians, dazzled by Assyria's ruins, spun tales of a queen who built hanging gardens and marched into India, feats that mirrored the exploits of Alexander the Great. But the real Semiramit's power lay in quieter, more enduring acts. By securing her son's succession and stabilizing the empire's core, she ensured Assyria's golden age could dawn under his rule. The irony, the very myths that inflated her story also buried her true legacy under layers of fantasy. Archaeologists still piece together her world from broken steles and cuneiform tablets, but one truth emerges clearly: Semiramit didn't need mythical exploits to be remarkable. In a civilization that measured greatness by military campaigns, she proved that holding an empire together could be just as formidable as expanding it. The monuments she left behind few, as they are, whisper a challenge to history's usual priorities, asking us to reconsider what true power really looked like. Himiko's story emerges from the mist of ancient Japan like a half-remembered legend, part history, part divine mystery. Chinese chronicles from the 3rd century tell of a shaman queen who rose from the chaos of warring clans to rule Yamatai, a kingdom whose location scholars still debate. The Weizhai, a Chinese historical text, describes her as a recluse who governed through magic and mysticism, communicating with spirits while her brother handled day-to-day affairs. But this was no passive priestess. Her diplomacy with China's Wei dynasty reveals a ruler keenly aware of the power of symbolic alliance. When she sent tribute including 20 slaves and bolts of exquisite cloth, she received in return the golden seal of recognition, a token that legitimized her authority in the eyes of her people and rivals alike. What makes Himiko truly fascinating isn't just her political acumen, but how her legend intertwines with Japan's most sacred mythology. Some scholars see echoes of her in the sun goddess Amaterasu, the Shinto deity who withdrew into a cave, plunging the world into darkness until lured out by the other gods. Like Amaterasu, Himiko was said to dwell in shadows, her palace guarded by towers and palisades, her presence shielded from common view. This wasn't mere isolation, it was theater of the divine, a calculated performance of sacred remoteness that elevated her above mortal rivalries. Even her death sparked upheaval. Chronicles recount how her passing led to such chaos that a teenage girl, Io, was briefly elevated to quell the unrest before Yamatai's factions tore themselves apart. The archaeological record adds tantalizing layers to her story. In northern Kyushu, where many place Yamatai, burial mounds from her era contain bronze mirrors identical to those gifted by the Wei dynasty, some etched with motifs of celestial beings, as if mirroring Himiko's role as bridge between heaven and earth. Elsewhere, clay figurines of female shamans with outstretched arms suggest a wider tradition of women mediating the spirit world. Yet the silence of Japanese texts about her is deafening. It's China's records that preserve her, a reminder of how often history is written by outsiders looking in. Modern Japan still grapples with her legacy. Nationalists once dismissed her as a Chinese fabrication, unwilling to accept that early unification might have come through a woman's hands. Others embrace her as proof of Japan's ancient matriarchal roots, pointing to later empresses like Suiko as her spiritual heirs. Walk through the torii gates of Ai's shrine, dedicated to Amaterasu, and you might sense Himiko's ghost in the rituals. The way the chief priestess still performs ceremonies hidden from public gaze, or how the sacred mirror, said to hold the sun goddess's spirit, remains unseen by all but the emperor. Whether queen, deity, or both, Himiko's greatest power was her ability to dwell in that liminal space between the seen and unseen, leaving a legacy as enduring and elusive as morning fog over the island she once ruled. The Trung sisters didn't just rebel, they became living symbols of resistance, their names forever etched into Vietnam's soul as the first to defy an empire and win. Picture the Red River Delta in the year 40 of the Common Era, where Han China's iron grip had tightened for over a century. Heavy taxes crushed farmers, Confucian bureaucrats mocked local traditions, and the governor's cruelty reached its peak when he executed Trung Tialatawanefsi's husband for protesting unjust laws. But this wasn't just a story of personal vengeance, it was the spark that ignited a revolution. With her sister Trung Nhlatawanisibi beside her, Trung Tialatawanefsi transformed grief into a war cry, rallying nobles and peasants alike under a single banner. What happened next was nothing short of astonishing. Within months, the sisters' forces, many of them women, liberated 65 fortresses, sending the Han governor fleeing south in panic. For 3 glorious years, they ruled as co-queens, abolishing Han taxes and restoring indigenous customs. Vietnamese folklore still paints the scene. Trung Tialatawanefsi, clad in golden armor atop an elephant, her sister at her side as they led charges with swords gleaming. But their true genius lay in unity. Where Han China had tried to divide clans, the sisters wove them together through shared mythology claiming descent from the dragon lord Eletawan Ea-1 Si Long Quan and the fairy Queen Ao Ko, Vietnam's legendary progenitors. This wasn't just rebellion, it was a cultural revival. The Han Emperor couldn't tolerate such defiance. In 43, his veteran legions returned with a crushing counterattack. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the sisters faced a grim choice: surrender or suicide. They chose the latter, leaping into the hot river rather than submit, a moment immortalized in poems and temple murals. Yet their legacy refused to die. Across Vietnam, villagers erected shrines where their spirits were said to ride white horses protecting the land. Even the Chinese chroniclers, eager to vilify them, admitted their courage grudgingly. Today, their story pulses through modern Vietnam like a heartbeat. Hanoi streets bear their names, their statues stand guard in squares, and every February, lotus flower processions honor their sacrifice. Historians debate whether they were truly feminist icons in a modern sense, but their power lies deeper. They proved that resistance could wear a woman's face. When French colonizers arrived centuries later, it was the Trong sisters' banners that rebels raised anew. Their rebellion lasted 3 years, their defiance echoes forever. Wu Zetian didn't climb the ranks of Tang Dynasty China. She hacked her way through them with a blade of ambition sharper than any sword. Born the daughter of a timber merchant, she entered Emperor Taizong's harem at 14 as a 5th-rank concubine, a position so low she should have vanished into history's footnotes. But Wu had a weapon none of her rivals anticipated, a mind that memorized classics, composed poetry, and dissected court politics with surgical precision. When Taizong died, tradition demanded she shave her head and retire to a convent. Instead, she caught the eye of his son, Emperor Gaozong, with a daring gamble, returning to court as his concubine while the empress still reigned. What followed wasn't just a palace coup, it was a masterclass in political annihilation. Step 1. Eliminate the competition. Wu allegedly smothered her own infant daughter, framing Empress Wang for the murder. Historians debate the truth, but the outcome was undeniable. Wang was deposed, and Wu took her place by Gaozong's side. But she wasn't content to be just another empress. When strokes left Gaozong debilitated, Wu seized the reins of government, issuing edicts from behind a screen while her husband's ministers fumed. Her policies revealed a ruler ahead of her time. She slashed taxes for peasants, expanded the civil service exam to recruit scholars outside the aristocracy, and even commissioned a dictionary documenting characters for women's names, a subtle act of rebellion in a Confucian world that erased women's identities. Then came the ultimate taboo. After Gaozong's death, Wu didn't fade into widowhood. She orchestrated the removal of 2 puppet emperors, her own sons, and in 690 declared herself Emperor Shengshen, founding the Zhou dynasty. No woman had ever claimed the mandate of heaven outright. To justify this earth-shattering act, she turned to Buddhism, commissioning scriptures that reinterpreted the future Buddha Maitreya as female. Giant stone carvings at the Longmen grottos depicted her as a bodhisattva, her face merging with the divine. When a farmer discovered a jade stone engraved with prophecies of a female ruler, Wu's propagandists made sure the entire court heard the heaven-sent message. Yet for all her ruthlessness, Wu's reign transformed China. She stabilized the Silk Road, patronized poets and scientists, and crushed rebellions with a mix of military force and psychological warfare, like displaying the heads of defeated warlords in cages outside the Imperial Library. Her spy network, run by ruthless officials like Li Junchen, purged dissent so thoroughly that even her own family wasn't safe. But in her 80s, the wheel finally turned. A coalition of nobles and generals forced her abdication, restoring the Tang dynasty. The woman who'd bent heaven and earth to her will died under house arrest, her stone memorial left blank, a final insult from the chroniclers who refused to grant her legitimacy in death. The irony, Wu's blank slate tomb became her most enduring monument. Later emperors, fearing her vengeful spirit, ordered sacrifices there for centuries. Today, feminists reclaim her as a proto-icon, while traditionalists still brand her a usurper. But walk through the halls of the Xi'an museums, and you'll find the truth in the artifacts. Gold coins bearing her profile, steels praising her virtues, and the faint echoes of a woman who dared to say the unthinkable, that the dragon throne could belong to her. Empress Lu Zhai didn't just pull strings behind the throne. She wove an entire web of power so vast that for 15 years the Han dynasty moved at her command. When her husband, Emperor Gaozu, died in 195 before the Common Era, tradition dictated that their son should rule, but Lu had other plans. With a new emperor, her own child, too weak-willed to resist, she became the shadow sovereign, proving that in ancient China, the real throne wasn't always the one made of jade. Her reign began with a massacre that would make even Machiavelli flinch. The rival concubine who'd once threatened her position, Lady Kai, became the first casualty of Lu's vengeance. First, she ordered Kai's hair shorn and her feet bound in chains, forcing her to grind grain like a common slave. But humiliation wasn't enough. Lu then severed Kai's limbs, gouged out her eyes, burned her ears, and forced her to drink a potion that left her mute. The final horror, she threw the disfigured woman into a pigsty, dubbing her the human swine. Even Kai's son, a potential heir, wasn't spared. Lu poisoned him slowly, ensuring no challengers remained. These weren't just acts of cruelty, they were calculated terrorism, a warning to anyone who dared question her authority. Yet beneath the brutality lay a ruler of startling competence. While her personal vendettas stained her legacy, Lu's political maneuvers stabilized a fragile empire. She filled the bureaucracy with her kinsmen, yes, but also with capable administrators who reformed taxes and eased the burdens on peasants. When nomadic Xiongnu taunted the Han by claiming they'd marry the widowed empress, Lu didn't take the bait. Instead, she sent a diplomatic letter laced with faux humility. "I am too old and frail to serve you," while quietly strengthening the northern defenses. Her restraint saved the dynasty from a costly war. The puppet emperors she controlled tell their own story. First, her son Emperor Hui, whose brief rule was spent drowning in wine to escape his mother's dominance. After his death, Lu placed two child emperors on the throne, their reign so nominal that court documents bore her seal instead of theirs. She even posthumously elevated her father to imperial status, a move so audacious it blurred the line between clan and state. The message was clear: blood loyalty outweighed Confucian hierarchy, but power, as Lu discovered, is a double-edged sword. Her death in 180 before the Common Era triggered a bloodbath as rival factions slaughtered her entire clan. The official histories written by her enemies painted her as a monster. Yet buried beneath the vilification is an inconvenient truth: the Han dynasty survived its turbulent early years because of her, not despite her. The same woman who mutilated her rivals also lowered taxes, patronized scholars, and kept the empire intact. Modern feminists debate her legacy. Was she a proto-Wu Zetian or merely a cautionary tale? Perhaps she was both, a ruler who proved women could wield absolute power, but at a price even she couldn't escape. The echoes of her reign linger in the quiet corridors of Chinese historiography, where the word ruthless often precedes effective, and where the first woman to rule China remains forever shrouded in infamy and undeniable influence. Amanirena's legacy gleams in the gold of the treasures she took to her grave, a queen who knew that brilliance could be both adornment and armor. When archaeologists pried open her pyramid at Mara in the early 19th century, they found a trove that would rewrite history: heavy gold bracelets inlaid with lapis lazuli, a necklace of serpent heads symbolizing royalty, and rings so finely crafted they seemed spun from sunlight. But these weren't just pretty trinkets. Each piece was a political statement, a visual echo of Kush's defiance against Rome's expanding shadow. Unlike her predecessors who cautiously navigated Roman power, Amanirenas chose confrontation. Inscriptions at the Temple of Ammon hint at her military campaigns, vague but tantalizing references to smiting the enemies and protecting the southern frontiers. Given Rome's push into Nubia during her reign, those enemies were almost certainly legionaries. The scale of her wealth tells its own story. The famed Berlin Museum collection, looted from her pyramid, includes a ceremonial shield ring depicting a goddess crowned with the sun disk, a direct parallel to Roman victory iconography. It's as if she was saying, "Your symbols of power, we have our own, older and grander." Even her amethyst scarabs carried a message. In a region where Rome monopolized gemstone trade, these stones were a silent boast of Kush's far-reaching trade networks. But the piece de résistance, a gold sheath for a now-lost dagger, etched with hieroglyphs declaring her, the one who terrifies adversaries, no mere title, this was earned. Roman records from Augustus' reign mention troublesome raids by Kushite cavalry near Aswan, attacks too coordinated to be mere banditry. Her military strategy mirrored her jewelry, flashy but precise. Unlike Amanirenas' scorched earth tactics, Amanirenas favored lightning strikes on Roman outposts, vanishing into the desert before reinforcements arrived. A fragmentary scroll from Alexandria's archives complains of desert phantoms ambushing supply caravans, likely her forces exploiting their intimate knowledge of the dunes. The twist: she may have learned Roman tactics firsthand. Some historians speculate she sent envoys to observe legionary drills during the tense peace after Amanirenas' war, adopting their siege techniques while adapting them to the Sahara's merciless terrain. The final irony lies in her pyramid's plunder. The very gold meant to proclaim her immortality ended up in European museums stripped of context, yet even in exile her treasures still whisper her audacity. That serpent necklace, a nod to the cobra goddess Wadjet, protector of pharaohs, those massive arm cuffs, worn only during ceremonies where queens danced in full armor, a ritual blending war and worship. Amanirenas understood something Rome never could, that in Kush, beauty and brutality weren't opposites, they were the twin blades of a queen's sovereignty. The sand may have reclaimed her citadels, but her gold still glows with the unbroken pride of a ruler who refused to kneel. Cleopatra VII's story isn't one of conquest or grand monuments, it's a masterclass in political survival within the viper's nest of the Seleucid Empire. Imagine ruling an empire so fractious that keeping the throne meant playing your own children against each other, all while dodging assassins and fending off Roman interference. That was Cleopatra VII's reality for nearly 20 years, a reign where every family dinner could double as a death trap. Born a Ptolemy, she was married off to 3 rival Seleucid kings in succession, each union less about love and more about shoring up alliances in a disintegrating kingdom. But this queen wasn't content to be a pawn. After her third husband, Demetrius II, was captured by Parthians, she seized control, ruling first as regent for her young son Antiochus VIII, then later sidelining him entirely. Her methods were as brutal as they were effective. When Demetrius eventually returned, expecting to reclaim his throne, Cleopatra VIII had him murdered, allegedly sending his severed head back to his Parthian captors as a macabre thank you note. Even her children weren't spared her machinations. Suspicious of Antiochus VIII's growing independence, she offered him a poisoned cup during a reconciliatory toast. The twist: he turned the tables, forcing her to drink it instead. The queen who'd spent a lifetime dosing rivals met her end by her own signature tactic, a grim punchline to a reign steeped in betrayal. Yet reducing her to mere treachery misses the bigger picture. Cleopatra VIII held the Seleucid Empire together during its death throes, balancing Roman demands with internal revolts. She minted coins depicting herself alongside her sons, a visual assertion of co-rule that couldn't mask the truth. She was the real power. Even her architectural patronage, like the temple she dedicated to Aphrodite in Ptolemais, wasn't just piety, it was soft power, aligning her with a goddess of sovereignty. The tragedy of her reign isn't just the bloodshed, it's that no amount of cunning could save the Seleucid Empire from its inevitable collapse. Her poison cup wasn't just an exit, it was an admission that some dynasties can't be salvaged, no matter how ruthless the queen. Dido's legend is a tapestry woven with equal parts poetry and politics, a refugee queen who built an empire from ashes, only to be remembered as lovelorn. Virgil's Aeneid immortalized her as the heartsick ruler who threw herself onto a pyre when Aeneas sailed away, but scrape beneath the myth, and you'll find a woman whose real story was far more calculating. Historical accounts from Tyre, the Phoenician city she fled, describe a princess named Elissa who outmaneuvered her murderous brother Pygmalion, escaping with a band of loyalists and the city's wealth. Her journey wasn't just flight, it was a masterstroke of economic piracy. When her ships landed on the coast of North Africa, she didn't beg for land, she bartered for it with the wit of a merchant queen. The famous ruse of the oxhide, cut into strips to claim a foothold, wasn't romantic folly. It was a legal loophole turned into national foundation myth. What's often overlooked is how strategically she positioned Carthage. Nestled between the Mediterranean's busiest trade routes, the city became a Phoenician stronghold against Greek encroachment, its harbors bristling with warships and warehouses. Dido's laws, recorded in fragments by later historians, reveal a ruler who blended Tyrian traditions with pragmatic innovation, tax exemptions to attract craftsmen, land grants for veterans, even a groundbreaking prohibition against human sacrifice to distance Carthage from older Phoenician rites. This wasn't the lovelorn woman of Virgil's epic. This was a CEO in purple robes, laying the groundwork for a superpower. Virgil's tragic twist, her suicide, collides awkwardly with the historical record. Tyrian texts claim she lived to old age, dying peacefully with Carthage thriving under her heirs. So why the fiery rewrite? Rome needed Dido as a cautionary tale, a brilliant woman undone by passion, a foil to Aeneas' disciplined piety. Augustan propaganda recast her as the emotional East to Rome's rational West, a narrative that justified Carthage's eventual destruction, yet the joke's on history. While Aeneas' Rome fell millennia ago, Dido's legacy lingers in the ruins of Carthage harbors, where modern divers still find Phoenician coins stamped with her era's symbols, silent witnesses to a queen who turned exile into empire. Cynane of Macedon didn't just defy expectations, she rewrote the playbook on what a princess could be. Born to King Philip II and an Illyrian warrior princess, Cynane grew up in a world where royal women were pawns in political marriages, not sword-wielding strategists. But her mother's blood ran fierce in her veins. While other noble girls learned embroidery, Cynane mastered the sarissa, the punishingly long pike that made Macedonian phalanxes unstoppable. By her teens, she wasn't just competent with weapons, she was forging an army of her own, training aristocratic women in the art of war. Historians whisper that these warrior women fought alongside her in actual battles, their presence so shocking that enemy soldiers reportedly faltered at the sight of armored noblewomen charging into combat. Her most audacious move came after Alexander the Great's death, when the empire fractured into squabbling factions. While generals plotted over scraps of territory, Cynane saw an opportunity for her daughter Eurydice, Alexander's half-niece. In a world where royal bloodlines were everything, Eurydice's marriage could tilt the balance of power, but the regents, terrified of Cynane's influence, tried to sideline her. Their mistake, underestimating a mother's resolve. With her private army at her back, Cynane marched Eurydice straight to the heart of the conflict, aiming to wed her to Philip III, Alexander's intellectually disabled half-brother who'd been thrust onto the throne as a puppet. The showdown that followed was pure Cynane. When the regent Alcetas blocked her path with troops, she didn't retreat, she challenged him to single combat. Ancient sources disagree on whether she actually killed him herself or fell to his soldiers, but the outcome was undeniable. Her death became a rallying cry. Eurydice, now a widow after Philip's assassination, inherited her mother's iron will, leading armies against Antipater before her own tragic end. What makes Cynane's story extraordinary isn't just her battlefield prowess, it's the blueprint she left. For centuries after, Macedonian noblewomen continued to study war, a quiet tribute to the princess who proved that in the Game of Thrones, sometimes the sharpest weapon was a woman who refused to play by the rules. Eurydice II stepped onto history's bloodiest stage not as a pawn, but as a player, only to discover that in the wars following Alexander the Great's death, even royalty could be ground to dust. Wife to Philip III, Alexander's half-brother and puppet king, she inherited more than a crown from her warrior mother Cynane. She carried forward a legacy of defiance. While Macedonian noblewomen were expected to mourn quietly in the shadows, Eurydice donned armor and rallied armies, her ambition as sharp as any general's sword. But standing in her path was Olympias, Alexander's mother, a queen whose ruthlessness had shaped empires and destroyed rivals. Their clash wasn't just personal, it was a battle for the soul of a fracturing kingdom. The moment Alexander's body cooled, the empire exploded into fragments, with warlords carving up territories like vultures over a carcass. Eurydice saw opportunity in the chaos. When the regent Antipater tried to sideline her husband, she publicly denounced him, seizing control of the army in a daring power grab. Ancient historian Diodorus paints the scene: a teenage queen standing before battle-hardened soldiers, her voice steady as she exposed Antipater's plots. The troops, stunned by her audacity, rallied to her side, at least temporarily. But Eurydice's fatal mistake lay in underestimating Olympias, who viewed her as an upstart threatening the Argead dynasty's purity. The older queen hadn't survived decades of court intrigue by playing fair. Their confrontation reached its brutal climax in 317 before the Common Era. After a botched military campaign left Eurydice isolated, Olympias pounced. Capturing the young queen and her husband, she didn't bother with a trial. She threw them into a cramped, windowless dungeon. Philip was executed first, his blood staining the same palace floors where Alexander once walked. Then came the slow, calculated cruelty reserved for Eurydice. Olympias gave her three choices: a noose, a blade, or starvation. Eurydice, ever defiant, chose the most protracted option, perhaps hoping for rescue, perhaps refusing to grant her enemy the satisfaction of a quick end. For days she languished in the dark, her strength waning as Olympia's soldiers watched impassively. In her final hours, she used a shard of pottery to scratch a message on the wall, not a plea for mercy, but a curse calling down vengeance on the house of Alexander. The irony: Olympia's triumph was short-lived. Within months, Cassander Antipater's son avenged Eurydice's death, executing Olympias in turn and desecrating her tomb. History remembers Eurydice not for her victories, but for her refusal to yield. In the ruins of Pella, archaeologists found a broken funerary stele depicting a young woman holding a spear likely Eurydice's, defaced by her enemies but never fully erased. Her story, like her mother's, became a whispered warning and a secret inspiration. In Macedon, even the most brilliant flames could be snuffed out, but not before scorching the hands that tried to smother them. Olympias didn't just lurk in the shadows of power, she slithered through them, wrapping herself around the Macedonian court like the sacred serpents she claimed as her familiars. Mother to Alexander the Great, she was no mere royal womb. She was a political tempest who wielded mysticism and murder with equal precision. Born a princess of Epirus, her marriage to Philip II of Macedon was supposed to forge an alliance. Instead, it ignited a war of wills that would echo through history. While Philip paraded new wives before the court, Olympias turned to the cult of Dionysus, where ecstatic rites and live snakes became her weapons of psychological terror. Courtiers whispered she slept with vipers coiled around her arms, a calculated myth that painted her as both untouchable and unhinged. When Philip took a new bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, no relation to the Macedonian general's daughter, Olympias didn't just fume in exile. She orchestrated her rival's annihilation. After Philip's assassination, a crime some historians still lay at her feet, she returned to Pella not as a grieving widow but as a queen reborn. Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant daughter were dragged before her, forced to watch as Olympias ordered their execution by fire. The message was clear: in the bloody game of succession, she was the only player who mattered. Yet her true masterpiece of manipulation was Alexander's rise. From his boyhood, she fed him tales of divine lineage, insisting he was the son not of Philip but of Zeus himself. When Alexander faced the Gordian knot, it was Olympia's voice in his ear urging him to slice through convention, and after his death, she became the architect of a dynasty's unraveling. With no clear heir, the empire fractured into warring factions. Olympias backed her grandson, Alexander IV, but when his regents proved weak, she took the field herself. Ancient sources describe her leading armies in person, her banner emblazoned with serpents, a chilling reminder of her spiritual and martial authority. Her downfall came as brutally as her reign. Trapped by Cassander, the son of Philip's old regent Antipater, she was given the same choice she'd once offered Eurydice, a quick death or slow starvation. She chose defiance to the end, starving for days while Cassander's soldiers taunted her through the bars of her cell. But even in death, she twisted the narrative. The Macedonians, fearing her restless spirit, granted her a hollow burial only for her grave to be mysteriously vandalized months later, as if the earth itself refused to contain her. Olympia's legacy is a paradox, a woman vilified as a monster yet indispensable to history's greatest conqueror. Without her, there might have been no Alexander. And without her ruthlessness, his empire might not have crumbled so spectacularly. Her true power lay in understanding that myths are sharper than swords, and that sometimes the most dangerous throne is the one hidden in a mother's whisper. Tuta of Illyria didn't just command pirates, she turned the Adriatic into her personal domain, a kingdom of ships where Rome's trade routes bled gold into her coffers. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, her reign as regent for her stepson Pins became synonymous with maritime terror, a name whispered from Corinth to Sicily with equal parts dread and reluctant admiration. But this was no lawless free-for-all. Tuta's piracy was state-sponsored strategy, a calculated move to strangle rival economies while filling Illyria's war chest. When Roman merchants complained their vessels were being plundered, her response became legendary. Piracy was simply Illyria's ancient right, our custom, she allegedly scoffed, to prey upon all who sail our waters. For a fledgling republic still solidifying its power, this wasn't just provocation, it was a direct challenge, Rome's retaliation. The First Illyrian War revealed just how formidable Tuta truly was. At first, the Senate assumed a show of force would suffice. They sent envoys demanding restitution, only for Tuta to have one murdered mid-negotiation, his body tossed into the sea like ballast. The message was unmistakable. Illyria bowed to no one. What followed was Rome's first military campaign across the Adriatic, a clash that exposed the limits of its naval power. Tuta's fleet, though outnumbered, knew every hidden cove and treacherous current along the Dalmatian coast. Her captains employed hit-and-run tactics, striking supply lines before vanishing into the maze of islands, leaving Roman galleys floundering in their wake. Yet the tide turned when Rome allied with Tuta's rivals, including Demetrius of Pharos, a turncoat admiral who betrayed her strongholds. Cornered in Rhizon's fortress by land and sea, Tuta faced a grim choice: annihilation or surrender. What happened next defied expectations. Rather than fight to the last ship, she negotiated terms that preserved Illyria's autonomy, albeit clipped. She retained her throne, but as a Roman client, her warships reduced to a token fleet. It was a bitter compromise, but a shrewd one. Rome got its symbolic victory, while Tuta lived to rule another day. The true measure of her legacy lies in what came after. Rome, once dismissive of naval power, emerged from the war with a hardened fleet and a taste for Mediterranean dominance. Tuta's defiance had inadvertently shown them the path to empire. Yet in the rugged hills of Illyria, her name endured not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that even Rome could be forced to the bargaining table. Later historians, eager to paint her as a barbarian queen, missed the nuance. Her piracy wasn't mere banditry, but the weapon of a ruler who understood that control of the waves meant control of destiny. Centuries later, when Octavian fought his own naval wars, he'd face descendants of her tactics in the guerrilla admirals of the Adriatic. Tuta's real triumph wasn't in winning battles, but in teaching the Mediterranean's greatest power that some rules are written by those bold enough to break them first. While Boudicca's rebellion blazed across Britannia, another queen chose a path so different it would divide history's judgment forever. Cartimandua of the Brigantes didn't just tolerate Rome's presence, she leveraged it, transforming her tribe into a client kingdom that thrived under imperial shadow. Where Boudicca saw chains, Cartimandua saw opportunity, her reign a masterclass in realpolitik that kept the northern frontiers peaceful for decades. But this pragmatism came at a cost, etched most starkly in her betrayal of Caratacus, the fugitive resistance leader whose capture would stain her legacy as either shrewd strategy or unforgivable treachery, depending on who tells the tale. The Brigantes were no minor tribe. Their territory stretched across what's now northern England, a vast realm of hill forts and pasturelands that could have been a bulwark against Rome. Instead, Cartimandua embraced the invaders, securing her throne through treaties rather than battles. Roman historians like Tacitus, never fans of powerful women, grudgingly admitted her effectiveness, calling her rich in influence and protected by Roman power. Her capital at Stanwix became a hub of Romanized luxury, where wine amphorae from Italy mingled with local craftsmanship, proof that collaboration could be profitable. Then came Caratacus. After years of guerrilla warfare against Rome, the Celtic chieftain fled north seeking sanctuary among the Brigantes. What happened next remains one of history's most debated betrayals. Cartimandua, perhaps sensing an opportunity to cement her alliance with Rome, had him bound in chains and delivered to the governor. Tacitus paints the scene with theatrical disdain. A warrior who defied legions for a decade, humiliated by a woman's duplicity. But step back and her calculus becomes clearer. Caratacus wasn't just a fugitive, he was a spark that could reignite rebellion, destabilizing the careful balance she'd built. His capture earned her Rome's gratitude and prolonged her people's peace. The backlash, however, was inevitable. Her husband Venutius, likely already chafing at her pro-Roman policies, used the betrayal as a rallying cry. Their marriage, already strained, erupted into civil war. Cartimandua's response, a stroke of cold brilliance. She divorced Venutius and replaced him with his armor-bearer, Vellocatus, a social insult so profound it galvanized Venutius' supporters. When he launched his revolt, Roman auxiliaries had to rescue her, a stark reminder that her power depended on imperial muscle. The Brigantes fractured, and though she retained her title, her influence never fully recovered. History's verdict on Cartimandua hinges on perspective. To Roman sympathizers, she was a pragmatic ally who prioritized stability over sentiment. To Celtic nationalists, she was a collaborator who traded freedom for a gilded cage. Yet her reign exposes a truth often buried beneath Boudicca's legend. Resistance wasn't the only way to navigate empire. Cartimandua's Britannia wasn't one of fire and blood, but of trade roads and negotiated power, a path less dramatic but no less deliberate. The ruins of her forts, with their hybrid Roman-Celtic architecture, whisper of a world where survival sometimes meant knowing when to bend, not break. Her end is as mysterious as her choices. Some say she retired to Roman villas in exile. Others claim she faded into obscurity, her name scrubbed from tribal memory. But walk the hills of Yorkshire today, where the Brigantes once ruled, and you'll find neither statues nor songs honoring her. Just the wind over the heather, carrying the echoes of a queen who understood that sometimes the most controversial victories are the ones you live to see. Amanita didn't just build monuments, she redefined what power looked like in stone, her legacy etched into the very skyline of Kush. Alongside her co-ruler and likely husband, King Natakamoni, she transformed Mara into a jewel of the Nile, its temples and palaces standing as testaments to a partnership that blurred the lines of traditional gender roles. But here's what most histories overlook. Their building projects weren't just collaborative, they were revolutionary. In a civilization where pharaohs typically monopolized construction glory, Amanita's name appears just as prominently as Natakamoni's, her titles carved with equal grandeur into the sandstone. The Amun Temple at Nokka, one of their crowning achievements, tells the story best. On its towering pylons, Amanita isn't a demure consort standing behind her king. She's depicted front and center, smiting enemies with a war club while wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Kush. The message couldn't be clearer. This was a queen who ruled as violently and visibly as any man. Their architectural innovations went beyond symbolism. The pair pioneered a fusion of Egyptian, Roman, and indigenous African styles, creating a distinctly Kushite aesthetic. Take the Lion Temple at Noga, where Amanita's figure is rendered with strikingly African features. Full lips, broad shoulders, a departure from the idealized Egyptian forms of earlier rulers. She's shown offering incense to Aphrodite, the lion god of war, but with a twist. The god hands her the ankh, symbol of life, directly rather than through Natakamani. This wasn't just art, it was theology in stone, asserting her divine authority independent of her husband's. Even the temple's layout broke conventions, its entrance flanked by twin colonnades, one bearing Natakamani's likeness, the other Amanita's, forcing visitors to acknowledge their dual sovereignty before approaching the gods. The scale of their ambition becomes staggering when you trace their footprint across the kingdom. From the restored baths at Meroe, which mimicked Roman engineering but used local materials, to the sprawling Aphrodite temple at Musawwar at Es Sufra, where Amanita's cartouches adorn the inner sanctum, every project served dual purposes: practical infrastructure and ideological statement. Their most audacious move, reviving pyramid construction after centuries of dormancy. The royal cemetery at Meroe boasts dozens of steep-sided pyramids, including Amanita's own. Its chapel frescoes show her receiving tribute from Nubian, Egyptian, and Roman envoys alike. Archaeologists recently uncovered workers' receipts at the site, scribbled in Meroitic cursive on pottery shards, proving she didn't just commission these projects, she personally oversaw budgets and labor. What makes Amanita's architectural legacy truly groundbreaking isn't just the buildings themselves, but how they've forced historians to reconsider Kushite society. Earlier scholars assumed Natakamani was the driving force, with Amanita as a ceremonial figure, but the evidence says otherwise. At Wad Ban Nokka, their joint palace complex, excavators found seal rings bearing her name alone, proof she issued decrees independently. Even more telling are the countless smaller projects: wells, roadside shrines, granaries where only Amanita's name appears. This wasn't a queen content to share the spotlight. She was a hands-on ruler, ensuring her people remembered whose vision shaped their daily lives. The final irony lies in what happened after her death. While Roman emperors obsessed with erasing their predecessors' marks, Amanita's successors embraced her blueprint. Later queens like Amanirenas and Amanita II copied her temple motifs and titularies, a chain of female influence that lasted generations. Today, as conservators painstakingly restore the faded murals of Nokka, Amanita's face re-emerges from the plaster, not as an exception to the rule, but as proof that in Kush, the rule itself was far more flexible than we ever imagined. The sands that once buried her cities may have tried to silence her, but stone has a long memory, and in Mara's ruins, that memory still speaks loud and clear. Ada of Carrier's story isn't just about a queen reclaiming her throne. It's a masterclass in political survival, a tale where exile became leverage and a legendary conqueror became an unlikely ally. When her brother, the satrap Idrius, died, Ada and her husband should have inherited power seamlessly. But their nephew Pixodaros had other plans, staging a coup that forced Ada into exile within the very fortress that had once been her stronghold, the imposing hilltop citadel of Alinda. Most rulers would have crumbled, but Ada turned isolation into opportunity. From her mountain refuge, she watched as the tides of empire shifted. And when Alexander the Great marched into Caria in 334 before the Common Era, she recognized a chance to rewrite her fate. What happened next reveals Alexander's genius as much as Ada's cunning. Unlike other Persian satraps who defied him, Ada didn't raise an army. She offered something far more valuable: legitimacy. As the last surviving heir of the revered Hecatomnid dynasty, she held the loyalty of Carria's people even in exile. Ancient historian Arrian captures the pivotal moment when she sent envoys to Alexander, promising to surrender Elinda and recognize him as her heir if he restored her rule. It was a bold gambit, but Alexander, ever the strategist, saw its brilliance. By reinstating Ada, he wouldn't just gain a fortress, he'd secure the voluntary submission of a region notorious for resisting outsiders. Their meeting became the stuff of legend. Ada, by then in her 60s, welcomed Alexander not as a conqueror but as a son, adopting him into her royal line with a gesture that blurred the lines between politics and kinship. In return, Alexander handed her the keys to Halicarnassus, Carria's crown jewel, after his forces wrested it from Persian loyalists. But this wasn't mere symbolism. Ada governed as satrap in fact as well as name, issuing decrees and commanding garrisons while Alexander marched onward. The ruins of Elinda's storerooms, where archaeologists found grain records bearing her seal, prove she wasn't just a figurehead but an active administrator, stabilizing the region for her adopted son's empire. The deeper genius of their alliance lay in its cultural resonance. Ada knew Carria's strength was its hybrid identity, Greek enough to respect Alexander, Persian enough to placate local elites. She leaned into this duality, minting coins with both Macedonian and Carian symbols, a visual shorthand for unity. Even her adoption of Alexander played into local traditions, echoing Carria's matrilineal customs where power flowed through mothers and daughters as much as sons. For Alexander, Ada was more than a useful puppet. She was proof that his empire could absorb diverse traditions without fracturing. Her legacy outlasted them both. When Alexander died and his generals carved up his empire, Carria remained relatively stable, a testament to Ada's groundwork. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus, one of the ancient world's 7 wonders, owes its existence to her dynasty's earlier rulers, but its survival during her tenure speaks volumes. While other satrapies burned in the wars of succession, Ada's Carria endured, a quiet outlier in a crumbling world. Modern Bodrum, built atop Halicarnassus, still bears the imprint of her rule, not in grand monuments, but in the unbroken thread of a people who remember that their last independent ruler was a woman who turned exile into empire and a conqueror into a son. Czarina's legend rides out of the Scythian steppes like a storm, an expansionist queen whose name means golden, yet whose reign was forged in iron and blood. In the fragmented accounts left by Greek historians like Polyaenus, she emerges as a ruler who didn't just defend her nomadic kingdom, but redefined its borders through relentless campaigns. The Scythians, known for their horse archers and golden talks, were already feared across the Black Sea region. Yet Czarina took their reputation further, uniting disparate tribes under her banner and pushing into territories even her predecessors hadn't dared to claim. Her tactics were as fluid as the grasslands she ruled, lightning raids on sedentary kingdoms, followed by vanishing into the horizon before reinforcements could arrive. One story tells of her ambushing a Parthian army by hiding warriors in river reeds, their bows silent until the moment the enemy's horses drank, a move that turned the water red by midday. What sets Czarina apart isn't just her battlefield brilliance, but her diplomatic audacity. After years of clashing with the Parthians, she didn't just negotiate peace, she orchestrated it on her terms. The treaty, carved onto a now-lost steel, reportedly granted her people grazing rights in Parthian-held valleys, a concession no nomadic leader had ever wrested from the settled empire. Even more striking, ancient sources claim the Parthian king sealed the agreement by gifting her a dagger sheathed in gold, a symbolic surrender of his pride, acknowledging her as an equal. This wasn't mere coexistence, it was a recognition that Czarina's cavalry could outmaneuver walls and treaties alike. The mystery of her origins only deepens her legend. Some accounts paint her as a widow avenging her husband's death, while others suggest she was a rebel princess who overthrew a weak brother. The one consistency: Her capital, a mobile fortress of wagons and tents said to gleam with looted treasures, including a throne made from the melted helms of defeated enemies. Archaeological finds in modern Kazakhstan hint at this wealth. Gold plaques depicting armored women on horseback, their braids whipping behind them like banners. Whether these represent Tsarina or her elite guard, the message is clear. Here, women didn't just support wars, they led them. Her end is as enigmatic as her rise. Some say she fell in battle, her body carried away on a shield by weeping warriors. Others insist she vanished into the steppes, leaving only her name echoing across the trade routes she once controlled. The truth may lie somewhere between. In the rolling grasslands where she once ruled, elders still tell tales of a golden-haired queen who could outride the wind and outthink kings. A ghostly reminder that even empires bow to the right woman on the right horse. The Parthians, who later erased so many rivals from their records, never forgot Tsarina. Perhaps because for all their palaces and armies, they'd met one force even they couldn't chain. A queen who knew the land itself would always favor those who refused to be tied down. Rhodogun of Parthia didn't just lead armies, she became a living legend by turning a moment of vulnerability into an emblem of unshakable resolve. Picture this, the queen, her hair half-washed, messengers bursting in with news of rebellion in a distant province. A lesser ruler might have dismissed them until her attendants finished their work. Not Rhodogun. According to the historian Polyaenus, she leapt onto her horse with soap still clinging to her locks, vowing not to finish washing her hair until the revolt was crushed. This wasn't just dramatic flair, it was psychological warfare. By riding into battle with her hair undone, she sent a clear message to her enemies. Defiance would be met with immediate, relentless force. The rebellion itself was no minor uprising. Parthia's vast empire, stretching from the Euphrates to the Hindu Kush, was a patchwork of fractious satrapies and rival noble houses. When word reached Rhodogun that a key province had declared independence, she understood the stakes. If one region broke away, others would follow like unraveling threads. Her response was a masterclass in military efficiency. While her cavalry raced ahead to secure strategic passes, she ordered supply lines stripped to the bare essentials. No luxurious tents, no ponderous siege engines. Every soldier knew the goal: swift, humiliating retribution. What makes her campaign remarkable isn't just its speed, but its precision. Ancient accounts describe her targeting rebel leaders with surgical strikes, leaving their forces leaderless and demoralized. Unlike kings who relied on scorched earth tactics, Rhodogun focused on symbolic victories. She didn't burn cities, she burned effigies of the rebellion's instigators in public squares, a spectacle designed to erode morale without alienating the populace. Within weeks, the revolt collapsed, its ringleaders dragged back to the capital in chains. True to her word, she returned victorious before her hair could dry, her crown secured and her authority unquestioned. The deeper genius of her hair vow lies in its cultural resonance. In Parthian society, a woman's braided hair wasn't just personal adornment, it symbolized order and dignity. By leaving hers undone, Rhodogun transformed an act of supposed impropriety into a badge of honor. Coins minted after her victory depict her with loose strands framing her face, a subtle nod to the story that had already cemented her reputation. Even the Greek historians, who typically scorned barbarian queens, couldn't resist repeating the tale, though they missed its true significance. This wasn't just about speed, it was about redefining what a woman's body could represent in war. Her flowing mane wasn't weakness, it was a banner of unrestrained power. Her legacy endures in the unlikeliest places. Modern Persian idioms about acting like Rhodogun still describe someone who prioritizes duty over comfort. Historians debate whether the hair incident was literal truth or clever propaganda, but the archaeology of Parthia offers clues. In the ruins of Hecatompylos, excavators found a fresco fragment showing a helmeted woman on horseback, her hair whipping behind her like a comet's tail. Whether it's Rhodogun or not, the image captures her essence, a ruler who understood that sometimes the most potent weapon isn't a sword, but a story too compelling to forget. And in the annals of history, few stories stick like a queen who conquered chaos with wet hair and an iron will. From the battlefields of Britain to the sun-baked temples of Kush, these 30 rulers shattered the illusion that ancient power belonged solely to men, but their stories also reveal striking patterns in how they wielded that power. Some, like Amanirenas and Boudicca, mastered the art of asymmetric warfare, turning their smaller forces into nightmares for imperial armies through psychological terror and scorched earth tactics. Others, like Hatshepsut and Wu Zetian, wrapped themselves in divine authority, rewriting religious narratives to justify their rule in societies that feared female leadership. And then there were the diplomatic virtuosos Pujuhepa drafting treaties with Egyptian pharaohs, or Cartimandua playing Rome against Celtic rebels with chilling precision. What unites them isn't just their brilliance, but the brutal choices they faced: conform to systems never built for them or tear those systems down and risk being branded monsters. The real mystery isn't how these women ruled, it's why we forgot them. Look closely at the gaps in their histories and you'll notice the same fingerprints. Roman historians reduced Zenobia to a rebellious harlot, Egyptian priests chiseled Hatshepsut's name from monuments, and Greek writers inflated Semiramis into a mythical seductress. Erasure wasn't accidental, it was political. When societies couldn't deny these women's achievements, they distorted them, spinning military genius into madness, diplomacy into witchcraft, and political marriages into nymphomania. Even the exceptions prove the rule. Cleopatra's reputation survived only because Rome needed a cautionary tale, while Wu Zetian's blank memorial stone became a monument to the historian's revenge. Yet their legacies refused to stay buried. Archaeologists brush dust from inscriptions bearing their names. Linguists decode forgotten letters where they negotiated peace or plotted wars, and every generation rediscovers their stories with fresh outrage. That's the paradox these women leave us. The more their enemies tried to silence them, the louder their voices echo across centuries. Perhaps because their greatest rebellion wasn't leading armies or building empires, it was proving that power, no matter how hard patriarchy tries to define it, has never had a gender. Now we turn to you. Which of these rulers left you awestruck? Was it Wu Zetian's ruthless reinvention of Chinese rule, or Artemisia's naval brilliance at Salamis? Maybe you're drawn to lesser-known figures like the Scythian queen Tsarina, whose golden legend still rides the steps. And who did we miss? History's margins are crowded with women whose stories deserve the light, so shout them out below. Because the best way to honor these 30 trailblazers isn't just remembering them, it's unearthing the countless others still waiting in the shadows. The past is a mosaic we're still piecing together, and every fragment changes the picture.